Alan Ladwig, welcome to the Astroben podcast. How are you?
I'm doing great today, Ben. Thanks for having me.
No problem. It's great to chat. We've been in communication for a year or so now, and you've been on
Yeah.
my list of people I really want to talk to. So, for those listeners that may not have heard of yourself, can you share a brief overview of your journey in the industry, perhaps from your early career all the way up to your current role?
Well, I've recently kind of semi-retired after a wonderful 50-year career in the aerospace sector. I began with a education organization in the mid 70s that studied and promoted space activities. And one of the things we were promoting back then was student experiments on the space shuttle. And NASA really didn't want to hear about that at the time. They were in the middle of building the shuttle. It was over budget, over schedule. But eventually, in 1981, NASA decided to have a high school student experiment program, and I was hired at NASA to run that program. So the Space Shuttle Student Involvement Project ran for many years. In fact, they still have student experiments going to the space station, but I was really proud to help get student experiments on those early space shuttle flights. That merged into being the manager for the Spaceflight Participant Program at NASA, which included the Teacher in Space and Journalist in Space programs. Unfortunately, after the accident, that program was put on hold. And then, meantime, Sally Ride had come to headquarters and offered to lead a long range study of where NASA should go in the future. And I became her assistant, and we had a close working relationship for the rest of her life. I left NASA in the late 90s to go write a book. And because I was the one that got all the letters from the public that wanted to fly in the shuttle during the Spaceflight Participant Program. And I wanted to honor their dreams and talk about what the history had been. So I started writing. Unfortunately, there wasn't much going on in the early 90s of what was actually going to happen. So the thing dragged out a while. I worked in the private sector for a while. I was the editor of Final Frontier magazine for a while. And then I went back to NASA under the Clinton administration to become the head of policy and plans. Left after that to rehook up with Sally to join space.com when it was formed in 1999. She left, I got laid off. I went to work with Northrop Grumman for a while, then a consulting company. Somewhere in there, I worked for Zero Gravity Corporation when they first got started, that offers the parabolic flights. I went back to NASA under the Obama administration to be the head of public outreach, and then I retired, but quickly joined Mariah Tanner with the Star Harbor Space Academy concept. That's still going on. I remain on the board, but I no longer am working on a day-to-day basis. And then somewhere in there, I finished the book in 2019, and even though the book was finished before the first flights actually took place for suborbital flights, the history remains solid. My predictions remain spot on. And what I tried to do in the book was, why do people think they're going to get to fly in space? Well, because for the last 70 years, we were told by the politicians, NASA, visionaries, the media, that our ticket to ride was just a rocket away. So what I tried to show was, well, here's what was being said over all these years about the likelihood of space tourism, beginning way back with Robert Goddard in the 1920s. And then overlaid on that was, well, here's what was actually happening with the space program. So you see something, for example, in the early 60s when the Mercury astronauts had been selected. You had a paper at the International Astronautical Federation Congress presented by Max Hunter talking about nuclear engines, and we'd be able to travel to the moon in a couple of hours for $500. So there were stories like that all through the book, and I think in the end it ends up being a valid history. And as I said, I'm still proud of my predictions. that we wouldn't fly by the end of 2020, and in fact, that's what happened.
Fantastic. Such a illustrious career. So lots of things I want to touch on, obviously. But let's start with the book a bit more. So it's called "See You in Orbit: Our Dream of Spaceflight." So what inspired you to sort of delve into this subject? Was it your sort of insights, during your career? Was there a particular moment that sort of space tourism sort of stuck out as a?
Well, it was from the Spaceflight Participant Program. This started in 1984. And remember, and some of your viewers who were born after 1984 are going to think this is ancient history. Well, to me, it was like yesterday. But back then, computers weren't used a lot. Email wasn't used a lot. So we got, letters through the mail from people, and with their pictures and their drawings and their hopes and their dreams and their aspirations. And then I was the guy that had to send them back a letter. Initially, I tried to answer each letter. It got to be overwhelming. We had to go to a form letter, but I had to kind of dampen their dream and say, sorry, not at this time. But the letters stuck with me. And even after the accident, all the letters we got from people that said, please don't cancel this program. It would not be proper in the name, in honor of Krista McAuliffe, the teacher that was selected. You should keep the program going. Well, unfortunately, it didn't keep going. The one footnote I should make is that NASA kept kicking the can down the road of whether or not they would fly the backup teacher, Barbara Morgan. And then on his last day in office, Administrator Richard Truly said, well, you know what, I think it's probably time we could fly the teacher. But, excuse me, he was gone and kicked the can down to Dan Golden, the next administrator, and he had it studied a couple times. I was on at least one of those committees that looked at it. And again, it was like, well, there was a lot of opposition from the media, from certain members of Congress that didn't think it was safe enough to fly a civilian. So finally, in the mid-90s, Senator John Glenn, former astronaut John Glenn, starting to let it be known that he wanted to fly in the shuttle. And there was a lot of sentiment that, well, he deserved it. I always had a hard time with that because, who deserves to fly in the shuttle? If he deserves it, does Buzz Aldrin deserve it? Do the other Apollo astronauts deserve it? Does some movie star deserve it? In any case, as a Marine, he had Marine allies at NASA in high-level positions, and they supported his quest. So we were in a meeting when it was discussed and decided that John Glenn should get to fly. And then I said, well, what about Barb Morgan? And at first it was said, well, that's different. John Glenn's an astronaut. Well, he hadn't been in a space environment for over 30 years. He had never been on the shuttle. So I kept pushing. And finally, astronaut Fred Gregory, who was then the head of the shuttle program, said, well, how about we'll make Barbara an astronaut, full-fledged astronaut? And that sealed the deal. So Barbara became an astronaut in the kind of late to mid 90s. She eventually flew on STS-118, got to go to the space station. And so that all ended up very well. Then the other ending of that teacher story is that NASA eventually allowed educator astronauts to apply. And 3 astronauts were selected that way. And at least 2 of them actually went on to perform the education activities that Krista McAuliffe had planned to do on the shuttle. They performed them on the space station. So for me, that was a huge milestone and a nice way to close out that story.
For sure. What you mentioned that quite a few of your sort of assumptions and predictions about space tourism have come to fruition over the years. Can you talk more specifically on that? So obviously you've got companies like not SpaceX yet, but certainly Blue Origin, Virgin Galactic, Axiom. Do any of those companies sort of stand out to you and are doing anything different than you might have predicted over the years?
No, I think what they had said has turned out to be true. I think one thing that's been interesting to me is initially we thought there'd be a lot more weightless time on the suborbital flights. And as it turns out, it's maybe 4 minutes. And I, of course, have not been on one, so I can't tell you exactly. But what I read, it seems to be around 4 minutes. So that's not very long, especially when the overview effect community, of which I participate, felt that even a suborbital flight would allow you to have a overview effect or a orbital perspective. In fact, there's a meeting tomorrow with the Overview Society where one of the people that flew on Virgin is going to talk. I'll be interested to hear what he has to say about that. But if you've only got 4 minutes of weightlessness, and it takes a few minutes just to get acclimated and floating around and enjoying that part, and then somehow get over to look out the window, and boom, you get the overview effect. So I'm anxious to hear what the people that have actually gone have to say about that. The other part that stands out is how, especially Virgin Galactic, kept promising when their flights would be, and it kept getting pushed back. When the X Prize was first inaugurated in 1996, it was said, well, the prize will be won in 2 to 3 years, and then 3 to 4 years after that, there'll be commercial tickets available. Well, of course, that didn't happen. The X Prize wasn't won until 2004. Even then, Branson is saying, oh, well, we'll be flying within 5 years. And especially the British press was pretty severe with him on all of these promises he made, because it was like, well, it's going to be this coming Christmas. Oh, it's going to be this anniversary. It's going to be that. Well, finally, it happens much later than had been promised. And now that we look back, well, does it matter what was said back then of how soon it would happen? The fact is, it's happening. So not to dwell on the promises that were made, but in fact, the promises that have been kept, and the fact that people are now flying. And if my math is correct, including the Axiom flights, the suborbital flights, and the Inspiration 4 flight, I think there's been 63 people that have flown as under this kind of space tourism umbrella. A lot of people don't like being called space tourists. They want to be called researchers. They want to be called astronauts. If they pay as much money as they've been paying, they can call themselves whatever they want, as far as I'm concerned. So, but the other criticism had been, well, space is just for the rich, and only the rich are going to get to go. Well, of these 63, again, if my math and counting has been correct, and I don't include those people that went with the Russians in the early 2000s, Dennis Tito and Anush Ansari and those folks. But of the other ones in the more recent times, of the 63 that have flown, 32 are people that are of wealth. About 8 I count as people that paid their own way and maybe aren't all that wealthy. And then about 23 that were either sponsored or had their flights picked up by somebody. And so 32 of the 63, about half, are the wealthy, and the other half aren't so much. Now, if you're going to fly with Axiom, you damn well better be wealthy, because you've got a $55 million ticket just to get to the space station. The suborbital flights, Virgin raised its price from $200,000 to $450,000, and incidentally, they raised that price at $450,000 just a couple of months after Richard Branson had said, well, it won't be long and these flights will be $45,000. So we're kind of going the wrong direction there. We don't know what people pay on Blue Origin. They seem to refuse to publish what they're charging. They've asked the people who have flown not to comment on what they were charged. We do know that the first winner of the lottery they had paid $28 million. And that person that won had a scheduling conflict and couldn't go on his flight. It's like, you pay $28 million and you got a schedule conflict? What, are you going to the dentist or something? So the next person in line of the and I'm forgetting right now. It was something I think like over 170 people bid. So they kind of went down the line, and one of the Blue Origin people told me, he says, "Well, we're going to keep going down that line to see what people are willing to pay." And they still haven't announced a set ticket price. So we'll see. Of course, they haven't flown for, I guess, almost a year now because they had that accident with their cargo flight or a malfunction when it landed. I think they have announced the next or a future flight. I don't know if it's the next flight, but a future flight will be all females on the flight, including Jeff Bezos' current partner, and she'll be like the lead on it. But I haven't been able to find out when that flight is scheduled.
No, it's
And of course, meantime, Virgin Galactic has flown, I guess now 4 or 5 times, and have had no problems. People seem to enjoy it. And what is interesting is that these last couple flights hardly broke into the news cycle at all. So I kind of feel unless there's somebody really famous, because we're a celebrity obsessed culture, people aren't going to pay all that much attention unless there's somebody on board that they can identify or know from their fame.
exactly. And as you mentioned the overview effect, community, which I hadn't heard of before. And that's all about, the people that are going, obviously it's great that the non-billionaires, there's a path as well. But it's also just seeing real people that, look like them going up. And how do you think, in terms of inspiring the public, does space as a concept, has it sort of evolved in the public imagination throughout your career? So in terms of, PR and storytelling, how has space tourism changed through the public's perception of space?
Great question, Ben. Initially, the Spaceflight Participant Program came about because the public felt that they weren't getting the real story of what the space experience was like. They felt the astronauts were too reserved. They weren't eloquent enough. They weren't poetic enough. Which, by the way, some of the astronauts really resented because many of them go out and give public speeches. They're in demand. Many of them have written books. So in a way, it was a bit of an unfair criticism at the time. But I think it had more to do with people wanted to identify. They wanted to know that somebody's going was more like them. And most astronauts, let's face it, NASA and the space community almost went out of their way that astronauts were special people. Goodness, the Mercury astronauts were seen as gods. Mercury was a messenger of gods. The Mercury astronauts were the gods. So over the years, people wanted to know more. Well, what is it really like? So the Spaceflight Participant Program was created to scratch that itch. And the first category was teacher. The second category was a journalist. That was an ongoing competition at the time of the accident. The next category wasn't solidified, but we were looking into the possibility of an artist, which would have really been interesting, but also very hard to figure out, well, who's an artist? So then over the years, when you had somebody like Dennis Tito flew, well, he was more like us, I guess, except he was a millionaire, or maybe a billionaire. I don't know. He paid $17 million for his flight. So it's a little harder to associate with him. Plus, NASA and ESA were very much against his even going to the space station. But then the other 6 astronauts, or the 6 people that flew through that program, made things better known. Then you come up with the suborbital flights and things like Inspiration 4. Inspiration 4 is an interesting story because Jared Isaacman is a billionaire, but he had 3 people join him at no cost to them. And they had interesting stories. You had Hallie, I'm trying to blank on her last name.
Arsenault.
Yeah, from who worked at St. Jude's and was a cancer survivor. She had a great story to share. And the fact that they used the flight to help raise money for St. Jude's Hospital was a great another story. You had Cyan Proctor, who was a teacher and an artist, and she had her own story to tell. And then Chris Savonsky, who's the luckiest man in the world, the guy who actually won that seat couldn't go. I forget what the exact reason was, but he gave the seat to Chris, which is a pretty nice gift to give.
Yeah, it's a nice
Well, they
call
each
together.
had stories, and they got to orbit the Earth for 3 days and look out the cupola of the Dragon, and it was very interesting. So they were in the news for a while, but that story has kind of drifted off, although Jared Isaacman wants to do more of those kinds of flights. So it'll be interesting to see who he picks. The suborbital people that have flown, of course, the first flights were noteworthy, with Branson finally being on board. The first flight of Blue Origin was noteworthy because Jeff Bezos is finally on board, and Wally Funk, the woman who was one of the what they called the Mercury 12 or I forget if it was 12 or 13 if you include Jerry Cobb, but they had wanted to go through the same physical exams that the Mercury astronauts did, and they only got to go through the first phase of 3 phases, and the program was canceled. So Bezos smartly selected her to be able to fly, and that drew a lot of public attention. And then when he flew William Shatner, of course, from Star Trek, that was a big public draw. And Michael Strahan from ABC flew. So when you had these well-known people flying, they got a lot of media attention. I had a chance to be on CBS a couple times to discuss those flights. But then as the people became more, we wanted common people, by God, we got them. But nobody really pays attention to their flights as much. So I'm sure they have interesting stories to tell. I just haven't seen where they're telling those stories. And it's got to be beyond the space choir. It's got to be beyond space conferences, because, we've already drunk the space Kool-Aid. We think it's a great thing. It ought to be something everybody does. The word has to get out to the non-space community of why going into space is important. What can we learn from that? Does the overview effect have a long-lasting impact on our psyche, on our decision-making processes, on how we view the Earth? And that all remains to be seen. By the way, the overview community is led by Frank White, who wrote the famous book, The Overview Effect. God, it's been 30 years ago now. He's done another book since then. And the community gets together on Zoom meetings every so often, and they have a different person speak. And as I said, tomorrow's speaker is somebody that flew on a recent Virgin Galactic flight.
Yeah, it's a fascinating time to be alive, and I guess it's a sort of good thing that we're not hearing about it every day, because it's becoming more normalized. But maybe there's a role for people like rappers and fashion celebrities, people that are very much outside that circle, but do, like it or not, have a huge amount of influence across the globe to inspire people to look up at the stars.
Yeah, another good example, and it's several years away, is the Dear Moon project, where the Japanese billionaire who flew to the space station on his own dime and now has purchased a flight to go around the moon with SpaceX, assumedly in the Starship. And that was originally supposed to happen in 2023. Of course, that's not going to happen. Starship still hasn't been certified. But he did something kind of cool with a international competition for artists to submit applications to fly with him. He ended up picking, I think it's around 8 people. They include an entertainer, a singer, a filmmaker, a photographer. So he kind of has picked some of the people you're talking about. Whether or not they're all that famous, I have to go back and look at the list again. It's been a while since I looked, because since there's been so many delays, I'm kind of waiting to see what happens and who sticks around. But that will be interesting. And part of that deal is they have to commit for a year after the flight to help go out and tell their story. And I think that's an important part, is get out there after the flight and tell your story.
100%. Well, look, in your in your career and in your book, you look about you look about the promises on space tourism, and we're all very optimistic about it, obviously. Um, but looking forward to the future, how do you see the future of space tourism unfolding? Do you think it's going to be a sort of exponential growth once the access to space comes down, and when do you think that might be?
Well, I think that's the important phrase, exponential. If you look at this on a linear basis, excuse me, it's not all that promising. And of course, the holy grail of the ticket price is like $45,000. That's the figure that I came across the most in my research, the most that people talk about. Oh, it won't be long. We'll get that price down to 45,000. I think it's going to take some extraordinary advances to see that happen, especially when the price now with Virgin is 450,000. The price to go to the space station is 55 million. We don't know what Blue Origin is, but it seems to be in the millions at this time. So what's it going to take to get that price down? And people tell me, they tell me I'm being too negative, which I don't mean to be. I'm trying to be a little more realistic and play down a little bit the quote aspirational goals everybody keeps talking about. And why is that? Well, it's because I wrote the history. I looked at the history of what was being said and what was real. You know, they senior NASA people during the beginning of the shuttle program said that there'd be 60 flights a year and the price would come down to $50 a pound, maybe $25 a pound. These people were not idiots. They weren't hucksters. They really thought that was going to happen. So when I go fast forward another 40, 50 years and see people kind of making the same claims of what the prices are going to be, excuse me, I'm going to be a little skeptical. I'd be thrilled if those prices come down the way are being predicted. I'm just a little curious of when that's going to happen. I don't, if they're charging 450,000 now, how is that going to come down to even half that price over the next few years? I mean, you've got to really ramp up a flight rate. It's not that the customers aren't there. Virgin Galactic evidently has over 600, I see between 600 to 800 people that have put down deposits or waiting. So the customer base is there, I guess, but it's at what price does this become a real business? And I think that remains to be seen. I'm hopeful that the Virgin and Blue Origin continue to make advances with their technologies, with their especially the operations end. That's where a lot of the cost comes in. So I hope they meet that. And then you've got the wild card of Elon Musk and SpaceX with his claims that by 2030 we could have 100 people on Mars, which I'm really skeptical about. That it could cost as little as $100,000. So again, there's a lot of numbers thrown out there. There's a lot of promises thrown out there. And as I said, it doesn't do any good for us to go back now and say, well, back in 1960, they said it'd be $500 to go to the moon and back, even though that's not the case today. So I'm not going to sit here and rain on anybody's parade about the future. I have the same hopes that a large number of people can go. I just remain a little dubious about when all that's going to happen. I believe that there's the four phases of space tourism that Dr. Pat Collins, who's a researcher of space tourism, came up with back in 1986, actually right after the Challenger accident. He actually came up with something, and excuse me. The first level, I always forget what the four levels are. The first one was kind of the pioneering phase. That's where we are now, and that's where the cost is pretty much. And then there's another phase where the cost drops down a little bit, and then there's another phase where more and more people get to go, and the fourth phase is the mass market phase. So I think we're certainly quite a ways from a mass market phase. I think to get to that second level, with with being somewhat less expensive, is probably at least 5 years away. So we'll see how it all plays out. But in the end, I hope many people get to have their dream to fly in space.
Absolutely. Well, look, it's been great to chat to you, and hear about your your varied career. And you worked at places like NASA and in industry. So just for young aspiring space professionals listening, what advice would you give them to consider when entering the field of space exploration and potentially space tourism specifically as well? What would you advise them to look out for? Where should where should they be sort of looking towards?
That's a great way to end, Ben, because one thing I do enjoy is encouraging younger people because I had the benefit, and as I put in the beginning of my book that I dedicated it to all my mentors. And so my advice to young people entering is latch on to a mentor. Don't be shy. Go up to somebody you are inspired by or you admire and talk to them. Tell them what your dreams and aspirations are. Ask for their advice on how to go forward. And my own experience has been people are very willing to be mentors. They're thrilled to be asked to be a mentor. So my motto has kind of been get a mentor, be a mentor. And so that would be my key advice is get somebody to help guide you along the way. Join organizations. Don't be shy. Meet people, the professionals in the field. Give papers, give talks. Get out there and build your network. And I think you'll be amazed at how great your career can be.
Alan Ladwig, thank you very much.
Thank you. See you in orbit.